I want you to imagine yourself as a German peasant in the early 1700s. Bear with me for a second. Your life is mostly silent. Yes, you hear the sound of the wind brushing up against your wooden shutters. You hear birds singing in the morning. You hear the crack of the axe as it bites into cold timber, the quiet patter of livestock. But what you don't hear is music every single day, the way that a person living in 2025 does. It is mostly small, quiet, ambient sounds. And then it's time for church. You pull off your stiff woolen coat, gather your children, and walk into town. And that's when you hear this. The music isn't just outside of you, it's within you. The organ pipes seem to shake the entire church and everything in it. You're listening to the music of your local organist, Johann Sebastian Bach. I find it just amazing to think that some of the greatest, most universal music in history was created for church services in a little town in the middle of Germany of less than 10,000 people. Johann Sebastian Bach isn't just one of the great classical composers, he's one of the great artists of all time in any medium, up there with Da Vinci and Shakespeare. So today we're talking about a man whose music has reached farther than any empire, lasted longer than most religions, and inspired a kind of devotion typically reserved for saints or prophets. We're going to see how he was able to compose not only such great and transcendent music, but so much of it. We're also going to be taking a look at what his music meant to him and what it means for us. Welcome to How to Take Over the World.
I'm going to show you how great I am.
This will have tiny power.
I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, I'd like to take this chance to apologize to absolutely nobody.
Hello, and welcome to How to Take Over the World. This is Ben Wilson. Many people remember that when in 1977 the Voyager spacecraft was launched, opinions were canvassed as to what artifacts would be most appropriate to leave in outer space as a signal of man's cultural achievements on Earth. The American astronomer Carl Sagan proposed that if we are to convey something of what humans are about, then music has to be a part of it. To Sagan's request for suggestions, the eminent biologist and author Lewis Thomas answered, "I would send the complete works of Johann Sebastian Bach." After a pause, he added, "But that would be boasting." That is from the excellent biography Bach, Music in the Castle of Heaven by renowned conductor and author John Eliot Gardner. I'm excited to talk to you about Johann Sebastian Bach. I know some of you will probably roll your eyes. He is the boring old composer whose music is just an unrelenting succession of 16th notes, right? Late Baroque music. Not the easiest to enjoy for many people. But I think even if you don't like classical music, it's just a lesson in how to produce unbelievable volumes of great art. And hopefully I can teach you to enjoy Bach if you don't already. I think one of the great testaments to the power of Bach comes from Friedrich Nietzsche. If you don't know, Nietzsche, who was a philosopher, came to truly hate and loathe Christianity. And Bach is the most Christian of all composers. He was an extremely religious Lutheran who viewed his music as an extension of his duty to serve and worship God. It is really very deeply Christian music. And Nietzsche, in his book called The Antichrist, which should tell you a little bit about what it's all about, he ends it by declaring war to the death against Christianity. And he proposes complete ostracization of Christians and even proposes, quote, "The execrable location where Christianity brooded over its basilisk eggs should be razed to the ground, and being the most depraved spot on earth, it should be the horror of all posterity. Poisonous snakes should be bred on top of it." Okay, in other words, he advocates nuking Jerusalem and breeding it with poisonous snakes so that no one will ever go there again, just because that is where Christianity was born. That is how much Nietzsche hates, loathes Christianity. And yet, this is what Nietzsche says of Bach, quote, "This week I heard the St. Matthew Passion 3 times, and each time I had the same feeling of immeasurable admiration. One who has completely forgotten Christianity truly hears it here as gospel." Okay? Wow. Like, what a testament to Bach. That someone who loathes Christianity so much, when he hears Bach, can hear the gospel and hear it as gospel. And it's funny, I have heard two different people, both of them Jewish, claim that Bach almost makes them want to become a Lutheran. So I think when you understand his music, it has a way of reaching through barriers and speaking to anyone and everyone. It is simultaneously very grounded in a certain place and tradition. It is very German, very Christian, very Lutheran, and also at the same time, somehow very universal. And that is one of the paradoxes of Bach. I think his life is one of the best case studies I've seen of what happens when a person fuses talent with genuine fanatical religious devotion, plus iron discipline, plus a kind of playfulness and sense of fun. So let's get into it. My main sources for this episode were Bach, Music in the Castle of Heaven by John Eliot Gardner and Johann Sebastian Bach by Christoph Wolff. So with all that said, this is The Life of Johann Sebastian Bach. First, I want to take a second to shout out today's sponsor, the AustinAI Lab. They create AI agents tailored to your business's needs. They are some of the best in the business in AI. I've had a chance to get to know their founder, Alejandro, who is a big fan and supporter of How to Take Over the World. I think everyone right now needs to be thinking about their AI strategy. Saying you aren't an AI business is a little bit like saying that you're not an internet business in 1999, right? Like everything was about to become an internet business, whether you liked it or not. And I think that's true of AI as well. And since this is so important, you want to be working with the best, right? And the AustinAI Lab has some of the best researchers and implementation specialists in the world. They have more than 200 successful implementations under their belt. So they have the experience to make sure your project is a success. And best of all, they have a business model where they don't win unless you win. They don't make money unless they save you money or add to your revenue. So go to AustinLab.AI today to get in touch and make sure to let them know that I sent you. This episode is also brought to you by Gains in Bulk. They are my favorite supplement company. They make the world's only instantized creatine. It's fully water soluble, making it more digestible than competing creatine, which gives you less water retention and bloat. Creatine is the most tested supplement on the planet. It's the only supplement that I take every day. I love it. It promotes muscle growth, recovery, cognitive performance, and more. You know, it's not just bodybuilders that should be taking creatine. I think everyone should be taking it. It's a great supplement to your diet to just enhance overall life quality. And Gains has other great supplements as well. They have great protein powder, pre-workout, and more. So check them out at gainsinbulk.com and use code BEN for 20% off. Johann Sebastian Bach was born in 1685 in Eisenach, a very small town in the province of Thuringia in central Germany. And the first thing you need to understand is that Bach was born into a musical dynasty like no other. The Bach name was basically shorthand for musician across central Germany. So for example, when there's a vacancy in the city of Arnstadt, the Count of Arnstadt asks his servant if he can urgently acquire a Bach. That's literally what he says in the letter. Hey, can you find a Bach? Like it's something you could grab from the grocery store. That's how well known they were as musicians. They were known both as artists, composers, fine artists, great creatives, as well as craftsmen. They could fix your organ, acquire all the instruments that you needed. They could redo the strings on a violin if you needed. They also tended to be excellent musicians and singers, and they compose new works. They're kind of like an all-in-one bundle. If you got a Bach, he was going to be able to take care of all your musical needs in town. Actually, the most gifted musician of the previous generation of Bachs was not Johann Sebastian Bach's father, but his uncle, Christoph. He was a very innovative composer. And by the time Sebastian comes along, he was the 8th generation musician in the family of Bachs. Okay, so music was in his blood. And by the way, they also tended to marry other musicians. So most of the good musicians in Thuringia, if they weren't a Bach, were probably related to the Bachs in some way. So for Bach, there is no moment of discovering music. You can't even pinpoint a moment when his instruction begins. His mother was probably singing lullabies within minutes of his birth. Like, he is just steeped in music from the moment of his conception, frankly. Like, he never knows a moment where he isn't receiving some sort of musical education. Bach is involved in one of the most heartwarming stories of child labor you'll ever hear about. When he is young, he acts as an assistant for organ repairs and installations, crawling in between the pipes to inspect and fix things. It's like the positive, heartwarming version of Victorian-era child labor in factories, right? He's kind of doing the same thing, like going in this heavy machinery, and because he's small and has these delicate fingers, going in and getting into stuff and fixing stuff that the adults can't do. Okay, so there you go. First lesson, child labor, not always as bad as they say. Okay, so from the time he's a child, Bach basically has a destiny as a musician. So look, Laszlo Polgar in his book Raise a Genius says the best way to raise a genius is to introduce them to the craft before the age of 5, ideally around 3.5. And Bach provides evidence that, he might be onto something, because Bach is the greatest of all time. And, we don't know when he started. He couldn't tell you when he started, but it was certainly by age 3.5. The other big influence in the Bach family was religion, which we've already said, Lutheranism. They were an intensely religious family, and it was very easy to mix those two things, music and religion, because Martin Luther, who, if you don't know, was a Christian reformer who created this movement of Protestantism, kind of got a piece of Christianity to break away from the Catholic Church. So Luther himself was very musical. He encouraged music in worship. He's reported to have often asked, why should the devil have all the good tunes? Which is important because there's kind of another big movement within Protestantism, which is called Calvinism, and they were very opposed to worship music and music of all kinds. So the fact that Luther really encouraged music in worship is different from this other sect of Protestantism, and is what leads to this fusion that creates Bach. So Lutheran church services were very musical. Lutheran education was also very musical. You would learn all these Christian doctrines and scriptures by singing them. And that was a mnemonic device to help you remember all this stuff in a very religious education. And as a consequence, music played an outsized role in all these little Lutheran towns in Germany. Even a town of just a few thousand people would have a beautiful organ and a well-paid music director, and parishioners could expect to be treated to original compositions from time to time, even in these little small towns. And Bach really internalized this culture of music and religion. He was fervently religious his entire life. In later life, he would have an excellent library of religious texts. He would spend months' worth of salary on a rare volume of Luther. But what's more interesting is that this isn't just for external purposes, right? He's not just outwardly pious. Bach really believed it. Okay? This wasn't just a family tradition or a cultural script. Bach believed that he, as a composer, was carrying on the work of the Old Testament, okay, of offering up sacred sound in divine services. So in his Bible, you can go and you can find a note he has written. He writes, "This chapter is the foundation of all church music pleasing to God." And this is next to 1 Chronicles chapter 25. The start of this chapter reads, "David, together with the commanders of the army, set apart some of the sons of Asaph, Heman, and Jeduthun for the ministry of prophesying, accompanied by harps, lyres, and cymbals. Here's the list of the men who performed this service," and it goes on. Okay, so he's got this intense belief in this fusion of these two ideas, that he's looking through the Bible and finding justifications for what he does and why this is not just okay, but necessary to true religious worship. So he doesn't really just think of himself as a musician. In some ways, Bach thinks of himself as a sort of divinely appointed priest who is commanded by God to bring this religious music to people. And I think you can hear that religious devotion in his music. I think that is what people miss about Bach. People sometimes call his music mathematical. And in a way, I know what they're saying. It is, right? It's very regular. Its proportions are very mathematical. Leibniz famously said, "Music is the hidden arithmetical exercise of a mind unconscious that it is calculating." And I think Leibniz is correct. There is this incredible connection between math and music. I can't remember who said this, but one of the Manhattan Project physicists, speaking of Oppenheimer, said he was the only physicist he ever knew who wasn't musical. Okay, every other physicist he knew, and he knew all of them, right? He was in the Manhattan Project. Every other physicist he knew was very musical. And by the way, Oppenheimer's weakness as a physicist is that he wasn't a terribly gifted mathematician. So that's interesting, right? There's this connection between math and music. And why is that? Well, it is a mathematical language. So if you think about an octave, okay, what is an octave? I'll do a little, right now I'm in front of my computer, but I'll play on the piano a little bit later so you can hear what I'm talking about, okay? So if you think about an octave, it's the same note, but one register higher. Okay, so if you look at like a piano, it goes A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, Okay, so what does it mean that notes are repeating? What does it mean that you have C and then C? Okay, two C's. So I'll play an octave for you now. C, C. Okay, and you can hear they sound the same. You play them together and they blend perfectly. And we speak of them as being the same note. They're both C's. But what do we mean by that? They're the same note. Obviously, they're not actually the same note. One is lower, one is higher. So what do we mean when we say they are the same? Why do they blend this way? Why do they sound the same even though we know that they are different tones? And the answer is that the sound waves produced by the higher note in the octave have exactly half the wavelength of the same note at a lower octave. Okay? And so you can see there's like this mathematical relationship. That's why they sound pleasing together. It is 1 and 1/2 when you hear an octave together. That's just the most obvious example of a mathematical proportion creating harmony in music. But there are, of course, many different proportions and mathematical relationships that create interesting sounds in music. That is basically what music is, the creation of interesting and pleasing mathematical relationships between sound waves, different sound waves together. And it is true that Bach took a rigorous and mathematical approach to these relationships. There's a great quote from the book Johann Sebastian Bach by Christoph Wolff that Bach, quote, understood the elaboration of musical ideas not as an act of free creation, but rather as a process of imaginative research. And I actually think that is a really powerful paradigm for understanding creativity. It is imaginative research. So it's imaginative, it's open and curious and creative, but it's also research. It's pointed in a specific direction, it's trying to solve a specific problem or elucidate a specific idea. Okay, so, but anyway, my point of all that is even despite all of that, even despite all the rigor and the mathematical relationships and that Bach clearly understood those and played with those, okay, setting all that aside, it is not correct to view Bach as some Enlightenment expression of abstract ideas, okay? In fact, it's closer to the opposite. Bach was a religious fanatic. I don't necessarily mean that negatively. It's like he was an ecstatic, right? His music was an expression, I think, of religious ecstasy. So I think the way to understand Bach is to understand him as someone who is in the throes of religious passion, right? He's like the Appalachian, what do you call those guys? Pentecostal. He's rolling on the floor, handling snakes. And this is the music of this kind of frenzied mind who is in this sort of religious ecstasy. And it is the combination of that religious ecstasy with that great mathematical and scientific rigor that Bach had, that fusion is what creates the greatest music of all time. Okay, so takeaway number one, my first lesson learned is that all great leaders, whether they're generals or entrepreneurs or musicians, have some version of extreme belief. For some of them, that is religious belief, like Alexander the Great or Joan of Arc. For Napoleon, it was destiny. He believed in destiny the way that Bach believed in the Bible and Martin Luther. For entrepreneurs, they believe in innovation or in their products. Phil Knight, the founder of Nike, has a great quote about why he was horrible at selling encyclopedias, but great at selling Nike shoes. And he writes, driving back to Portland, I'd puzzle over my sudden success at selling. I'd been unable to sell encyclopedias, and I'd despised it to boot. I'd been slightly better at selling mutual funds, but I'd felt dead inside. So why was selling shoes so different? Because I realized it wasn't selling. I believed in running. I believed that if people got out and ran a few miles every day, the world would be a better place. And I believed these shoes were better to run in. People sensing my belief wanted some of that belief for themselves. Belief, I decided, belief is irresistible. Okay, I love that quote. Belief is irresistible. Irresistible. When you find something that gives you that fire in your bones, when you really believe, you're unstoppable. People find that, again, irresistible. And Bach had that belief. He was very intensely religious, not necessarily in a very showy or pious way. He didn't broadcast his religiosity other than through his music, but that was the outlet for his personal devotion. In his biography, Gardner writes, Bach's working library, estimated to have contained at least 112 different theological and homiletic works, was less like a typical church musician's and more what one might expect to find in the church of a respectably sized town, or that many a pastor in Bach's day would have been proud to have owned. Okay, so that is how much he believes and is interested in religion and theology. he has a theological library to match most pastors, most people who do this professionally. He took his faith very seriously and believed very strongly. So that's my first takeaway. Bach had belief. Okay, so back to the story. I already told you, he grows up very religious, in a very musical family. He goes to school, where at first as a child, he doesn't perform remarkably well. And part of that is because he misses so much school. Now, the classic interpretation of this fact is that he was apprenticing to his father and was needed back at the family business, so his parents were pulling him out of school so that he could go apprentice. But later scholarship dug up some interesting facts about the school at the time. Basically, the headmaster had completely lost control, and this school was like a den for brigands and bullies to beat up on each other and commit petty crimes. So the second interpretation is that he was being victimized or bullied, or at the very least distracted, so his parents might have pulled him out of school for long stretches to get him away from this sort of dangerous environment. So that's kind of the second interpretation. However, John Eliot Gardner has a very interesting take on the second hypothesis, and he basically says, well, how do we know that Bach was a victim in all this bullying? And he brings up, facts. Bach was quite large, quite tall. He ended up about 5'11", which was very tall for the age. He was very spirited. He frequently quarreled in later years. He got into a fist fight at least once. He was thrown in jail once. He was once reprimanded for bringing an unknown single lady into the choir loft and teaching her about music. Okay. So this is someone who was very energetic, could be mischievous. He would end up fathering 20 children. If you're picturing him as this dusty, nerdy guy in a powdered wig, hunched over a harpsichord all day, that is not who Bach was. He was a presence, and he often managed to impose his will. So the point that John Eliot Gardner makes is, if the rebelliousness of the school was the reason that Bach was pulled out of school for a time, how do we know that he was the victim and not the victimizer? And I like this image. I like to think of Bach, the schoolyard bully, turning kids upside down and stealing their lunch money. Do I think that's actually true? Probably not exactly. Ultimately, we can never know what did or did not happen when he was just a child in school. But what we do know is, at the very least, he was a prankster. And he probably was not a shrinking violet who was just bullied all day, and so his parents had to take him out of school. In a letter to Bach's biographer, his son Emanuel Bach wrote, "There are many adventurous stories about him. A few of them may be true and concern useful pranks. The deceased never liked to hear them mentioned. So pray omit these humorous things." Okay, and I think that's a real shame. Because of that, those stories just never got passed down. So we know Bach was a prankster, but what those pranks were is lost to time. So yeah, probably Bach was on some level caught up in participating in some of the mischief making that was going on in the school. To what extent, we don't know. And what his pranks actually were, we cannot tell. And by the way, this is one of the great commonalities of great achievers. They are pranksters when they're young. Steve Jobs was a great prankster. So was Thomas Edison. So was Lee Kuan Yew, Alexander Hamilton, John Wooden. The list goes on and on. Add Bach to that list. Okay. So when you're looking for great people, look for the pranksters. For whatever reason, there's that connection there. And so maybe these were innocent pranks. Maybe he was bullying other kids. Either way, I think this image serves as a much needed corrective image to that of Bach as, what we think of as Bach. Anyways, so Bach has this childhood. It all changes when he's 8 years old. Tragically, both his mother and father die within 9 months of each other. Of course, for a family as large and close-knit as the Bachs, there was no chance that he was going to experience real hardship. He was going to go to an orphanage, but still, it takes a heavy toll on him emotionally to see his parents go when he's only 8. He's very close with his uncle Christoph, that is sort of the great musician of the family, and in part probably because he connected with that aspect of his personality and was interested in it and knew he wanted to do that. However, Christoph can't take him, so he actually ends up going with his much older brother, who he barely knows, also named Christoph, ironically, Christoph Bach. His brother is also, like all Bachs, a successful musician, and he does quite a bit to teach young Sebastian the basics of composition and theory. He's a little heavy-handed and sometimes a stickler for the rules. One of the famous stories is that Christoph has this book of difficult music from the likes of Vivaldi and Pachelbel and all these other great composers. And young Sebastian Bach really wants to try to take it on even at this very young age. He's like 9 or 10. And Christoph won't let him. He's not your time yet. Stick to the basics, line by line. That's how you learn. And so Sebastian Bach is sneaking into the attic and reading this sheet music by moonlight until he is eventually caught and reprimanded by his brother. So, Bach is relentless. He's very high agency. When someone puts up obstacles to what he wants to learn, he just goes ahead anyway. He finds a way. So Bach is living with his brother, and now he's at a very different school because he's got to move towns to be with his brother. And this school is apparently not as rambunctious. He doesn't get pulled out as much for whatever reason he was being pulled out. And so he doesn't have the same issues. And in fact, he starts to get very good grades. So as a teenager, he finishes number 4 in his class, despite being one of the youngest students. And then the next year, he finishes first in his class. And as soon as he is able to leave and escape his brother's tutelage, he does and heads north to Lüneburg to continue his musical studies. So this is when he is 15 years old. He was the first Bach to complete the upper classes at the gymnasium and qualify for university studies, although he never does actually attend college, attend a university. So at 15 years old, he travels the 200 miles to Lüneburg. I believe this would be close to the longest journey he makes in his life. And it's actually interesting. Bach never left Germany during his lifetime. And you might think, 1600s. But no, that was not normal even for the time. His contemporaries, Handel, who's another great composer from that era, traveled extensively, including to Italy and England. Scarlatti, who was also contemporary, he's from Italy, but he travels to Spain and Portugal. Telemann, another contemporary, he traveled throughout Europe, including to Paris. So, even by that era standards, it was the 1600s. People traveled less. Yes, that's true. But even by those standards, Bach was unusually provincial. It's kind of one of the paradoxes that the least traveled man of that era created the most interesting and dynamic music. It's kind of the most universal of that era. Anyway, he graduates from Lüneburg, and rather than trying to study at a university, he decides to pursue work. He applies for one job and is turned down. He briefly becomes a court musician in Weimar for 6 months. But anyway, he ends up back in Arnstadt, back in Thuringia. He's 18 years old, and he is called upon to inspect and certify the construction of the new town organ in Arnstadt. Now remember, Thuringia, this region, is just littered with Bachs. Okay, every stone you turn over, there's a new Bach who's an excellent musician, by the way, and knows everything about everything. Okay, and so the fact that all of these Bachs, there's all these successful musicians in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. The fact that all these guys are passed up within the family, and 18-year-old Johann Sebastian Bach is chosen to inspect the organ is a recognition that his knowledge of organs surpassed anyone else in the family. He truly is, even in this remarkable family, remarkably intelligent and knowledgeable about the craft of music and keyboard music specifically. And so he comes, he inspects this organ, kind of does his little repairs, tunes it up, and then he is chosen to play at the dedication recital for this new organ. And again, this is a signal that a new star has risen in the Bach family. He doesn't just have great technical knowledge. He is, in this family, the greatest musical family in Germany. At 18 years old, he is the star organist. So he plays at the dedication recital. He is then hired as the organist for the church in the town. He plays every week at church services. It's likely that he, for the most part at this age, he's probably playing other compositions, existing music, but he's already probably doing some composing. Basically, none of the compositions have survived from this time period, so we can't really judge its quality. But likely at this point, the music he's writing is competent, perhaps even interesting, but far from kind of his final form. Okay, so he's playing, he's composing. Let's talk about one of my favorite incidents from his early career that happens here at Arnstadt. So Bach is given extra responsibilities. Initially he's just hired as the organist, but he is eventually kind of promoted, or not even promoted because they don't give him extra money. And it's actually kind of against his will. But they ask him to also teach the students, the student musicians from the school associated with the church where he plays. So they want him not just to play the organ, but kind of coach the students in the choir and the other musicians and kind of help them get up to speed, right? But there are problems here. Number one, as we discussed, the students are famously unruly. That was in Eisenach, I think, but it's also true here in Arnstadt. Many of them are not well educated in musical technique and theory. And to make matters worse, Bach, he's completed his studies so early, he's actually younger than most of his students. So they're kind of embarrassed to be getting taught by this kid. And one day, he gets into an argument with one of his students, a bassoonist. Classic bassoonist behavior, am I right? Okay. And so apparently, things escalate, and Bach ends up calling him a Zippelfagetist. Okay, this is German, Zippelfagetist. I know it sounds kind of like a slur in English, but actually kind of does mean what you think it sounds like, because this literally translates to a greenhorn bassoonist. Okay, and in case I need to spell it out for you, a bassoon is a woodwind that you place on your lips. It looks kind of like a clarinet, if you know what I'm... Anyways, okay. So he calls him a greenhorn bassoonist. But apparently greenhorn is also a euphemism for you can imagine what. Okay, so John Eliot Gardner translates this insult as, Bach calls this guy a prick bassoonist. I've seen others translate it as a weenie bassoonist, all right? Like, you're playing the bassoon on... Okay, you get it? Do you get the joke he's making? In only 2 words, Bach is both calling him an amateur, you don't know what you're doing on the bassoon, but he's also like calling him gay, basically. Great insult, incredibly efficient use of words. You got to hand it to Bach. So this guy's incredibly offended, of course, gets some friends together, waits outside a street where he knows Bach will be walking, and then jumps him one night. He attacks him with a stick, ends up punching Bach in the face, and then Bach draws a sword. I've seen other sources that say it's a long knife. It's generally referred to as a rapier. Either way, Bach goes after him, actually manages to slash a hole through his cloak before people step in and break up the fight. Like, Bach almost stabs this guy because he fights him, all because Bach called him a weenie bassoonist. All right. I love this story because, again, it shows the real red-blooded Bach as he really was. The type of music Bach made could only have been made from a man with enormous emotion and passion, which he clearly possessed. His music did not come from a robot. It came from the type of guy who was willing to sword fight people over insults. Okay. So Bach was hot-headed. He was also in many ways a rock star and something of a diva. He was constantly fighting with the city council about his wages, about the state of the music department of his church, about his role and responsibilities. He becomes somewhat withdrawn and surly. In his most egregious move, Bach applies for leave to go to Lübeck, another city in Germany, for 4 weeks to hear the great organist Dietrich Buxtehude. And he's granted this by the city council. Okay, you can leave for 4 weeks, get yourself a replacement. He finds another Bach, of course, to come play the organ for him for 4 weeks. Because he thinks he can learn a lot from this great organist, Dietrich Buxtehude. So he walks 200 miles on foot to go see this guy. But once he gets there, he's like, this is great. He talks with him, has done dinner with him. He's learning so much from Buxtehude. And so he doesn't stay for 4 weeks. He stays for 4 months. Okay, so he is just AWOL, just missing, no explanation for 3 months. And so when he gets back, the superintendent asks him very reasonably, where the heck have you been? Like, you just didn't show up to work for 4 months. We knew you'd be gone for a month, but what's going on? And Bach replies, he says, I went, quote, to comprehend one thing or another about my art. Okay, so like, imagine that. You take 3 months off work with no explanation. You don't send word. You don't write. You just disappear for 3 months. And you come back and your boss says, hey, where have you been for 3 months? And your reply is, I was learning important stuff. I was learning this and that. Like, this is clearly not someone who is worried about keeping his job. By the end, one counselor writes, he shows little inclination to work. He is not even willing to give an explanation of the fact. A change will be necessary. A break will have to come soon. Okay. And the real point of conflict is not just that Bach was being a diva, just because he had a disagreeable personality. That is not true. Actually, most people liked Bach. He was being a diva because he viewed music as a way to come to know God. He views it as a religious necessity, not in some abstract sense, because he read it in the Bible, although there is that as well, but because he felt like he and others personally encountered God through church music. So how could you settle If that's the case, how could you settle for second-rate music? How could you not want to push to create the best music possible? Everything had to be the best. We are seeing and literally experiencing God here. Okay? Stop trying to tell me to just play the hits. Okay? He hated that. He was always pushing. He always wanted more musicians, better trained musicians, more commitment from the city council, more funds, more time to train, better instruments. I mean, he sounds like Napoleon at the Siege of Toulon. And I think he felt that same urgency that Napoleon felt. More, better, better, better. And the city council just wants him to chill. Like, I think they didn't see it that way, right? Like, hey, can you just stop freaking out our musicians? Can you just stop giving them in the choir such difficult music? Can you just play the tunes that everyone knows? Obviously they didn't see music the same way that he did. So anyway, Arnstadt and Bach eventually part ways after 3 years, and he takes a job in Mulhausen, which is a slightly bigger town. They pay him a little bit more. This was a step up in every way. More organized music department, everything. Also significant pay increase, which was important to Bach because in just 6 months, he was about to marry a woman called Maria Barbara. Every biography, by the way, calls her just Maria Barbara, which I appreciate because her name is actually Maria Barbara Bach, and she is his cousin. But I like that the authors don't rub our nose in it by calling her Maria Barbara Bach all the time. They just leave it at Maria Barbara. Okay, we don't need to draw attention to just the whiff of incest that's going on. Anyways, I do think the main draw of Mulhausen was not the pay increase, even though that was important to him and his growing family, but it was the professional choir, the more professional music department. And that's my second takeaway, I guess, is that Bach wanted to make great music. He was always pushing to make better music. And I think most people in most situations settle for good enough. And good enough was never good enough for Bach. There's a good quote about this phenomenon from Kobe Bryant. And I picked up this quote from David Senra over at Founders Podcast. And he quotes Kobe as saying, "It was easy to size other players up in the NBA. I found that a lot of guys played for financial stability. Once they got that financial stability, the passion, the work ethic, and the obsessiveness was gone. Once I saw that, I thought, this is going to be like taking candy from a baby. No wonder Michael Jordan wins all these championships." All right. So I think, Bach probably had the same phenomenon. A lot of guys are just trying to land a job as an organist or a court musician. And once they do that, okay, I'm settled, I'm good. They're not pushing to be great. But he did. And so that's my second takeaway. My first takeaway is belief. And then I think the second takeaway flows naturally from it. If you sincerely believe in what you're doing, then you're going to want to make it excellent, to make it as good as it can possibly be. And so the second takeaway is to pursue greatness. Speaking of David Senra, if you like How to Take Over the World, you will probably also love Founders. It's a podcast much like How to Take Over the World, but it's specifically for and about founders. It's one of the few podcasts that I really look up to and admire. David does a great job, and his episodes are always packed with amazing insights. As you just saw, I used some of them in my own show. Just about all his episodes are great, but if you're looking for one to start with, you might start with episode 376 about Jensen Huang, founder of NVIDIA. I love that one. Or episode 370 about Ingvar Kamprad, founder of IKEA. I love that one too. But he has tons of great episodes. Honestly, you can start anywhere and you'll probably get a great episode. So check it out. That is Founders, wherever you get your podcasts. So after Bach goes to Mulhausen, he spends a year and a half there, composes some great music, gets in trouble with the city council again for many of the same reasons, quarreling with musicians, writing music that's too difficult to perform, as well as for at least one new reason, which is, as mentioned before, he is caught with an unknown woman in the choir loft. He claims he is just giving her voice lessons. This is a family show, so I won't, say anything more, but the jokes practically write themselves. But then a year and a half later, he transfers to Weimar. It's only 18 months that he's in Mulhausen, which, if you'll recall, he starts his career in Weimar briefly. He's there for 6 months as a court musician. He leaves Mulhausen for the same reason that he left Arnstadt, which is the conditions in Mulhausen were better than in Arnstadt, but still not what he wants. Both of these are relatively small towns. We're talking, 5,000, 10,000 people. And he's technically just an organist at Weimar, as he was in both of these other towns. But he's actually highly recruited to be there, and he's more highly paid than some of the management, some of the brass. And after 6 years of being sort of a overqualified organist. He is officially promoted to Concertmeister, okay, music director. The benefit of being in Weimar is that it is a dukedom. So Germany at this time is not a nation state. It's not a country. There is no entity called Germany. It's just a geographic expression. What there is the Holy Roman Empire, which is a jumbled mess of all these territories and claims. Some of them are run directly by the church. They are, for all intents and purposes, owned by the bishop, by the church, I mean the Catholic Church, right? Some are free cities belonging to no particular nobility, not to the church. They're a city controlled by its city council. They're essentially little democracies like Arnstadt and Mulhausen. And some areas are owned by various members of the nobility, princes, dukes, counts, stuff like that. So Weimar is actually controlled by two dukes, an uncle and a nephew. And both happen to be very musically inclined and very willing to spend. So they have a court loaded with great professional musicians with no other obligations who are ready to collaborate with Bach. And furthermore, they are interested in Bach for Bach. In Arnstadt, he is sort of treated as a blue-collar guy. You got a job to do. You have to get the music ready for Sunday services. So, pick up your lunch pail, get things done. Anytime he tries to go beyond these duties and create amazing music, they're vaguely annoyed. Like, this isn't what we hired you for. But these dukes see him more as like an artiste, right? They're interested in him as a composer and as like a great artist. They want to create great things. And they want him to explore and be creative. So he composes cantatas for church services while he's in Weimar, yes, but he's also composing chamber music that is meant to be performed for its own sake. In fact, he starts writing the preludes and fugues that would later be assembled into the famous work, The Well-Tempered Clavier. You have almost certainly heard the opening numbers. Very, very famous. It goes like this. Okay, so Weimar is quite an idyllic time for Bach. He's well compensated. He has significant resources at his disposal and time to compose. His wife, Maria Barbara, gives birth to 3 sons in Weimar. He's promoted. Life is good. However, the same things that made Weimar idyllic also made it dangerous. Weimar was a monarchy, technically a duarchy, but a monarchy. Therefore, Bach was not subject to the same need to constantly justify himself as he was in Arnstadt and Mulhausen. His genius could spring forth as an outgrowth of monarchical largesse. But the flip side of that is that he was subject to the whims of these dukes. And the biggest problem on that front is, was not actually either one of them souring on him. He actually liked both of them liked him. But they soured on each other. This uncle and nephew had very different personalities. The uncle was more conservative and religious. The nephew was more modern and liberal, and the court orchestra became the object of their rivalry and competition because both were so musical. One duke orders them not to perform for the other duke, and then the other threatens to fine or even jail them if they listen to the other one. Like, it becomes this real mess. And everyone, all these musicians are hired by both of them, so they're like, they don't know what to do. They just don't want to get involved. And so Bach doesn't want to be involved either. He wants out. He starts looking for other jobs. He applies and is accepted as the Kapellmeister at Cothen, another city, another monarchy, this one a principality. But these dukes are not happy when they find out that Bach has sought employment elsewhere without their permission, and he's actually jailed for a month and nearly loses his job because the Prince of Cothen has no idea what happened to the Kapellmeister who he just hired. So Bach is in Weimar for 9 years before he is in jail for a month. And luckily, even though this prince is like, hey, what just happened to my new music director? He doesn't fire him, he keeps him on. And so then he's in Cothen for 6 years. In Cothen, his wife, Maria Barbara, suddenly dies. She catches ill while he's away and dies very unexpectedly. At this point, he has 7 young children. So he remarries quite quickly, this time to Anna Magdalena Wilke is her name, with whom he would end up having 13 children. And by the way, this must have been incredibly tragic for Bach. Everyone agrees that he had a very loving and close relationship with Maria Barbara. And this is just one of many tragedies that Bach suffered in his life. Only 10 of his 20 children would survive into adulthood. And even for the time, this is a very high child mortality rate. For an upper middle class family like the Bachs, yeah, like you could expect to lose a child or two in your lifetime, but not half of your children. I mean, that is a lot of tragedy for Bach. Both of his parents die when he's 8. He suffers a lot. But we know very little about how he felt during these time periods and how he dealt with all these losses. And that is because, on the one hand, it's true, Bach is not a very communicative person. We think, but we don't really know. And that is because virtually all of Bach's personal letters have been lost, which is a real tragedy. And it leads to some weird distortions. So, for example, we've been talking about all these run-ins he had in Arnstadt and Mulhausen. And, basically all the official correspondence of these courts from these cities are still around. So, like in Mulhausen and Arnstadt, you have all of these official correspondences, all these complaints between the city council and Bach. And then at the very end, they give an official proclamation when Bach is about to leave that Johann Sebastian Bach is the best and he's been a great organist and he's the best we've ever had and we love him. It's like, wait, what? All you guys did was complain and fight and argue, and now he's leaving and you're suddenly like, we loved this guy so much, we're so happy he was around. And it's because when you're happy with someone, you don't write an official report to the city council, right? You might write him a personal letter. Hey, great cantata on Sunday, loved it, you're great. You might tell him in person, you might shake his hand. And all personal letters that Bach had, like virtually all of them, have been lost. We don't have them. So it's not that Bach was nonstop feuding with every government where he went. It's just that only the complaints, the accusations, and the counter accusations have survived, which again, maybe gives us a distorted view of these relationships and how fraught and contentious they actually were. So it's distorted that way. And, we have no idea how Bach felt during these very difficult times. People like to say that he poured all of his emotion into his music. And that certainly seems true. His music has a ton of emotional depth. But we don't really know that to be true. Like, maybe he also poured his emotions into heartfelt letters and long discussions with close friends. Maybe he had close confidants who he relied on. We just have no way of knowing. All we do know is that it did have an effect on this beautiful music that he wrote. What I find most interesting is that he has many pieces that are clearly music about mourning, about loss, but they're not depressive. They manage to be optimistic at the same time. And this is someone who did not languor in or wallow in his sadness. This is a fundamentally energetic person, and I think a fundamentally happy person who picked himself up and found solace in God, I think, and found real optimism even in the midst of all this loss. Okay, so let's put a timeline here so we know where we are. Bach is born in 1685. He finishes all of his schooling at age 18. He is in Arnstadt and Mulhausen until age 23. Then from age 23 until age 32, that's 9 years, he's in Weimar. Or maybe it actually works out to 8 years, but whatever, you know how ages are. And then in Cothen for the next 6 years until he's 38. And then from 38 years old on, he would spend the rest of his life in the city of Leipzig. So he seems to have enjoyed monarchical arrangements much more than democratic ones, because, you could kind of, count on the largesse of these princes and dukes. But, it's like, if you like these arrangements, then why do you go to Leipzig as your final act? Which is, in fact, another free city with a city council, no prince, no duke. And he has many of the same problems and run-ins in Leipzig that he had in Arnstadt and Mulhausen. It's not like the problems go away. There is it's a bigger city, so there is more of an appetite for some of his more ambitious works. But, ultimately he considers the city council unreliable and penny pinching and annoying. So why does he do this? Why leave Weimar and Cothen? And the answer is, it's a big city. And he gets the top music appointment where he oversees the St. Thomas School and 4 different churches. It's one of the most prestigious music appointments in all of Germany. They actually say they hire him because he is a celebrity. Like, he's a celebrity for what, right? For being a virtuoso, for performing, not as a composer at this point. People actually, even at any point in his lifetime, people never really know his compositions outside of Germany. He's not known as a composer in his own lifetime. What he is known as is, in his youth, a great, great singer. Once his voice breaks, he no longer has this nice tenor. So he's no longer known as a great singer, but he's a great violinist and a great keyboard player, great organist, great harpsichordist. And because he wasn't appreciated primarily as a composer, there initially weren't many efforts to collect and preserve his music. And so we don't know how much Bach music has been lost. We do know that the number of cantatas alone that have been lost is in the hundreds, which is a real tragedy. But yeah, he wasn't known for his compositions. He really didn't become famous as a composer until the early 1800s. So, for example, let's look at something like St. Matthew's Passion, which is this unbelievably great work that he writes in Leipzig and is now very, very famous as one of Bach's more famous compositions. So how does it become famous? So let's go back to the beginning. Bach never wrote an opera, which was an art form that was flourishing at the time. Bach had been to Hamburg, a city that had a great opera scene, and so he had seen and experienced opera. But instead of actually writing an opera himself, what he did instead was to compose 2 passions, 2 retellings of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ to be played during Holy Week, the week leading up to Easter on the Christian calendar. And these had different singers playing various characters like Peter, Pilate, John. And so they technically aren't operas, but they are very operatic in their performance and in how they play out. And they're just unbelievably beautiful, especially the St. Matthew's Passion. This is really like Bach's magnum opus. It's unbelievable. In his biography, Wolff writes of it, quote, Leipzig audiences, deprived since 1720 of their own opera house, could experience in Bach's Drami per Musica something of what was offered by the Royal Opera in Dresden. At the same time, Bach's pieces were by no means poor or makeshift substitutes for real opera. His compositions demonstrate at every step full mastery of the dramatic genre and the proper pacing of the dialogues. So he writes the St. Matthew's Passion. It's played in Leipzig. We don't know for sure how it was received, but it was played there in Leipzig for the better part of a century, until 1800. Okay, so clearly it met with some acclaim, and it was recognized, at least on some level, for the masterpiece it was, or else, usually you would get new compositions, hear new music every Easter season. Why are they playing the St. Matthew's Passion every single year until 1800s? Because they recognize, on some level, this is something fantastic. At the same time, though, this St. Matthew's Passion by Bach was not performed in its entirety outside of Leipzig until 1829. Okay, that is 100 years after its first performance. Okay, one of the great works of art in human history wasn't heard outside of Leipzig for 100 years. In fact, the reason that so many of us know about it today is sheer dumb luck. It so easily could have gone the other way, because what happens is the great German composer Felix Mendelssohn, he's kind of 2 generations removed from Bach. And Felix Mendelssohn's grandmother happened to own a copy of the St. Matthew's Passion. And so he gets a look at it and he says, wow. And so Felix Mendelssohn puts on this performance in Berlin in 1829. And that was the right music for the right moment. And it sells out. The response is ecstatic. And then they sell out a second and third showing, and then it spreads like wildfire from there. It spreads outside of Germany and into England and France and all over Europe. Anyway, the Leipzig years are very productive for Bach in terms of composing. He's composing a ton. All these new, beautiful, amazing compositions are coming out. And they are well received, but that's not what he's known for at the time. At the time, he is known as an exceptional performer. And that's why he's really celebrated. He is famous in Germany as like the great keyboard performer of the age. And he's producing a lot of compositions, but they're not widely recognized at the time as works of genius. Probably the most famous incident in his Leipzig years happens towards the end of his life. In 1747, he was invited by Frederick the Great to come meet with him and perform in the King's Palace in Potsdam, just outside of Berlin, where Frederick was King of Prussia and where Bach's son, Carl Philipp Emanuel, Bach, was his court musician. And Frederick the Great was a genius, one of those few men with talent, not only in war and politics, but also in art and music. He was a great flautist. He played the flute, and apparently a halfway decent composer as well. And so Frederick the Great is always pestering Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach to invite his famous father to come perform for him. And finally he insists. He's like, hey, Bach, you got to invite your dad to come perform for me. And this younger Bach was actually more famous than his father during their lifetimes, especially as a composer. For whatever reason, even though now the father, Johann Sebastian Bach, is known as the great composer, at the time, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach was recognized more for that. Anyway, so together, Bach's son and Frederick invite him. Basically, Johann Sebastian Bach is coming to see his son and his newly born grandson. And he says, okay, while you're here to see your grandson, come to the court, play for Frederick the Great. It'll be great. But there's a trap, okay? Frederick the Great lays a trap for him in that they try and devise for him an impossible puzzle. Okay, Bach was known as a composer of fugues. And a fugue is a type of musical composition that takes one melody and then introduces new melodies on top. And these melodies have to follow a system called counterpoint, which has rules for what kind of themes can go together, which notes you don't want to play together, how often sequences can repeat, all this sorts of stuff. Okay, there are lots and lots of rules in counterpoint. So you can think of counterpoint as a sort of musical Sudoku puzzle. You take a melody and you have to find one of the few melodies that can go with it. And of course, as you add parts, first you got one melody, now you got two, now you have a 3-part fugue, you got 3 different themes, and you become more constrained in what you can do because every new melody that you add has to abide by the rules of counterpoint with all the other themes that came before it. The puzzle becomes harder. And so to have any, artistic merit while you're doing this is very, very difficult. So that's kind of fugue and counterpoint. And so when Bach is invited to the court of Frederick the Great, Frederick invites Bach to improvise a 3-part fugue. Okay, so just imagine how difficult that is. You're sitting down at a piano and coming up with a theme, a melody, and just that, just if you sat down at a piano and tried to pick out something that sounds good, that's not easy to come up with a little melody. But then you have to come up with 3 melodies all at the same time, and they all have to follow these rules of counterpoint and have to go together. Okay? So this is going to be impossible for anyone who is not like an extremely accomplished musician. However, Bach is an extremely accomplished musician, so being asked to improvise a 3-part fugue is perhaps not the craziest thing. What is crazy is that Frederick, probably with the help of Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, has devised an opening theme that is nearly impossible to work with. We actually don't know for sure that Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach had something to do with this. But the reason that I think he was involved is that this theme is so difficult to write counterpoint to that only like a really experienced musician, a musical genius, could have devised it, right? It's diabolical. It is a theme that is perfectly suited to resist counterpoint. And so Frederick the Great says, hey, welcome, so glad to have you, glad you could play for us. We're going to have you improvise a 3-part fugue. And by the way, here's the theme that you're going to be working off of. And so he gives him this theme. I think he actually plays it for him on the flute. And Bach must have realized that, like, oh, I've been set up. And there's no way of knowing, but I do wish I could know what went through his head as he sat at the piano and heard the theme that was played for him. And he's in front of the entire court, in front of everyone. I wonder if, the blood drained from his face, if he had a moment of doubt of, oh man, I'm in front of everyone. I've never heard a theme like this. This is impossible. This is a perfect trap. What am I supposed to do? Or was it the opposite? Does he hear it? And even though it's difficult, does he immediately know, nice try, Frederick, but I've got you beat? Because what happens is this perfectly laid trap wasn't enough to best the superhuman Bach, the greatest musician of all time. And look, I think to heighten the stakes of this moment, on a certain level, this was personal. Because in some ways, Bach and Frederick were very similar. Both were incredible geniuses with boundless energy. But in many ways, they were complete opposites. Frederick was very liberal and atheistic. Bach was quite conservative and religious. Bach had 20 children. Frederick was gay and had no children. Bach was tall. Frederick was extremely short. Bach was humble. Frederick was extremely proud and vain. So I think on a certain level, this contest was personal. I think Frederick was not only trying to humiliate Bach, but I think he was trying to humiliate religion, humiliate God and his representative in some way. Or even if he wasn't, I definitely think that's how Bach would have seen it. I think probably in this moment, he felt like he was wrestling with the devil. So what happens is, Bach begins playing, slowly at first, picking out the opening theme as slowly as he can to give him some time to think and plan. And then he adds a second theme, and then a third. Everyone was, quote, seized with astonishment, and the king was duly impressed. The king then asked him if he could create a 6-part fugue with the same melody. Bach said that he could, but he couldn't improvise it right now. So he promised to send the king the 6-part fugue later, and in the meantime, improvised a 6-part fugue on a different theme. And so he wins. I mean, it's like something out of a novel. Two of the great minds that Europe has ever produced match wits against each other, and Bach comes out victorious. Here's how the official Potsdam press release presents what happened. So this is King Frederick's, Frederick the Great's official press arm. This is what they put out in the newspaper. Quote, "One hears from Potsdam that last Sunday, the famous Kapellmeister from Leipzig, Mr. Bach, arrived with the intention to have the pleasure of hearing the excellent royal music there. In the evening, at about the time when the regular chamber music in the royal apartments usually begins, His Majesty was informed that Kapellmeister Bach had arrived in Potsdam and was waiting in His Majesty's antechamber for His Majesty's most gracious permission to listen to the music. His august self immediately gave orders that Bach be admitted, and went, at his entrance, to the so-called forte at piano, that just means a piano, condescending also to play, in his most august person, and without any preparation, a theme for the Kapellmeister Bach. Okay, so I guess he doesn't play it on the flute, he himself plays it on the piano, which he should execute in a fugue. This was done so happily by the aforementioned Kapellmeister that not only His Majesty was pleased to show his satisfaction thereat, but also all those present were seized with astonishment. Mr. Bach found the theme propounded to him so exceedingly beautiful that he intends to set it down on paper as a regular fugue and have it engraved on copper. On Monday, the famous man let himself be heard on the organ in the Church of the Holy Spirit at Potsdam and earned general acclaim from the listeners attending in great number. In the evening, His Majesty charged him again with the execution of a fugue in 6 parts, which he accomplished just as skillfully as on the previous occasion, to the pleasure of His Majesty and to general admiration. So Bach does create this composition and sends it to Frederick. We don't know if Frederick ever looked at what Bach sent him, but it is interesting that this composition is something of a challenge, okay, to Frederick. Reading now from John Eliot Gardner's biography, he says, in the copy he sent to King Frederick, he arranged for the inside page to be inscribed with the word Regis Iusu Cantio et Reliquia Canonica Arte Resoluta. At the king's command, the song and remainder resolved with canonic art. Bach was making a pun on the word canonica, his way of showing that his canons had been fashioned in the best possible way for the king's amusement. Did Frederick even bother to look at them? Did he realize that the initial capitals of Bach's dedication is spelt riscare, meaning to search out in Italian, and that Bach had deliberately refrained from writing the canons out in full, leaving them for him to discover? So in other words, Bach leaves all these hints telling Frederick to search out the answers. And I've seen multiple interpretations of this subtle messaging. In some interpretations, Bach is simply flexing on King Frederick. Basically like, I owned you when you tried to give me a puzzle. Now let's see what you can do. Here's a puzzle for you. Seek out the answer. So is he just saying like, thanks, now you give it a try. You seek it out. I bet you can't do what I can do. In other interpretations, and I find this maybe a little bit more convincing, Bach is encouraging the atheistic Frederick to seek out God. And he's leaving these things unfinished in order to point him in that direction and hoping that in the act of composition, he will find God, he will seek out God, riscare, the same way that Bach did and find him the same way that God did in music. And, I think it's unlikely that Frederick ever took up the puzzle and tried to solve Bach's puzzle that he gave for him. And if he did, he was a very gifted musician for a king. But this is not someone who spent all day, every day thinking about music. And he wasn't educated enough to probably pull this off. But I think Bach was sincere in his belief that if Frederick had done this, he would find God. I mentioned at the beginning Nietzsche and how he kind of heard the gospel in Bach, even though he didn't believe. There's a great quote from one of the most widely known contemporary composers. His name's Georgi Kurtag, who writes, "Consciously, I am certainly an atheist, but I do not say it out loud, because if I look at Bach, I cannot be an atheist. Then I have to accept the way he believed. His music never stops praying. And how can I get closer if I look at him from the outside? I do not believe in the Gospels in a literal fashion, but a Bach fugue has the crucifixion in it, as the nails are being driven in. In music, I am always looking for the hammering of the nails. That is dual vision. My brain rejects it all, but my brain isn't worth much." Okay, well, I'll basically wrap it up there. Bach dies 3 years later from botched surgery on his eyes. He had been suffering from blindness and from a number of ailments, probably related to diabetes. Bach drank a lot of beer throughout his life. He was overweight, and a lot of the symptoms that he had matched early diabetes. He passed away on July 28, 1750, and was buried in a grave that went unmarked for nearly 150 years. The chorale that he asked to be released upon his death included these lyrics: "Before your throne I now appear, O God, and bid you humbly turn not your gracious face from me, a poor sinner. Confer on me a blessed end. On the last day, awaken me, Lord, that I may see you eternally. Amen, amen. Hear me. Okay, well, that was a pretty high-level review of the life of Bach. So here at the end, I want to go through a few of my takeaways from Bach's life and how he worked, how he was actually able to do all of this, right? This is what the whole show is about. So first to review, the first two that we did kind of go over. One, the power of belief. Belief is irresistible. Number two, the power of trying to be great. Most people just settle in to coast and be careful. By setting your sights on greatness, you're already ahead of most people who aren't even thinking about it. And then the third idea that we talked a little bit about, I call this doing more with more, okay? It's the opposite of doing more with less. Doing more with less is about focusing on doing what you can with the resources that you do have. But doing more with more is about figuring out what you need in order to win and then doing whatever it takes to get those resources. Okay, there's no prize for being the least intrusive failure. Bach reminded me so much of Napoleon in that both are constantly hectoring their superiors for more resources. So don't accept the constraints that you have been given, challenge the constraints of your situations, and get a winning hand before you even start playing. There's no way Bach could have done what he did if he had been content to just sit in Arnstadt with the choir and orchestra that were not professionals, that weren't well paid, that didn't have the best instruments, and just accepted what he was given. So ask, hector, bully, plead, do whatever you have to do to get the resources to win. We often think of great leaders as doing more with less, and yes, there is some of that, including with Bach, but you also have to do more with more. Okay, number 4, put on your game face. Bach had this attribute that he was a very kind and personable guy when it came to his personal life, but in regards to his music, he could flip very quickly and show a different side. So from the John Eliot Gardner biography, he writes, peaceful, quiet, and even-tempered though Bach was whenever he encountered unpleasantness at the hands of third persons, so long as it was concerned only in his own personality, he was, however, quite another man when, no matter in what form, anyone slighted his art, which was sacred to him. In such cases, it doubtless happened at times that he donned his armor and gave expression to his wrath in the strongest ways. The organist of St. Thomas's, who was in general a worthy artist, once so enraged Bach by a mistake on the organ during the rehearsal of a cantata that Bach tore the wig from his own head and with a thundering exclamation, "You should have been a cobbler," threw it at the organist's head. Okay. Again, Bach had a way with words. Great insults, great insult. "You should have been a cobbler," he says to the organist, and takes off his wig and throws it at the organist. So Bach had this Jekyll and Hyde thing going on, right? He could be very kind. They were always receiving visitors and helping out the less fortunate in their home. He's very kind in his personal life, but his art was sacred to him. And if you messed with that, he was going to demand excellence from you. You know, I'm often asked by people how to be demanding, like Steve Jobs, like Coco Chanel, without becoming a jerk. And I think that's the answer. You put on your game face. You become a different person when you are talking about your life's work. Okay, so that's number 4. Number 5, try everything, but try the right thing first. Okay, again from the John Eliot Gardner biography. Whatever went on in his mind in terms of pre-composition or was first jotted down in sketches, Bach's working scores show us how concentrated and economical he was when actually composing. Among 20th century composers, Shostakovich is reported to have compiled his symphonies straight into full score on the basis that he didn't have time to make errors. He simply couldn't afford the luxury of making mistakes. Bach was much the same. Okay? And this reminds me of the Edwin Land quote. We try everything, but we try the right thing first. In other words, I'm ready to try everything to solve this problem. I will beat my head against this rock until it gives me water if I have to. And Bach does do that sometimes. Sometimes progress for Bach was slow and steady. Christoph Wolff writes, quote, one of the most remarkable chapters of Forkel's 1802 biography deals with Bach as the reviser of his own works. Here Forkel draws on his experience consulting many unpublished manuscripts. I have had opportunities, he writes, of comparing together many copies of his principal works, written in different years, and I confess that I have often felt both surprise and delight at the means which he employed to make little by little the faulty good, the good better, and the better perfect. Okay? So Bach is willing to try everything. However, as we heard from the Gardner biography, when he can, he writes straight into composition with very little in the way of workup or sketching. It comes kind of fully formed out of his mind. So you do want to be willing to try everything, but you don't want to let that make you lazy. You have to try to get the right answer and be economical if you can. Okay, so I like that formulation. I think it's a really smart way to approach things. Try everything, but try the right thing first. Okay, that was Edwin Land, and that was Bach as well. Number 6, and I love this takeaway, the power of anti-inspiration. Okay, again from John Eliot Gardner. Another source of the spark of his imaginative ability to elaborate comes in an observation recorded in 1741. He, quote, does not get himself up to speed to delight others with the mingling of his tones until he has played something from the printed or written page inferior to his own ideas, and has thus set his powers of imagination in motion. And yet, his superior ideas are the consequences of those inferior ones. Okay, so in other words, he can't come up with new original ideas until he has played something inferior first. I think that's so interesting. I've talked about this before, but I like to have both inspirations and anti-inspirations. Okay, there are podcasters who I listen to, like Jameson Olson, like Alex Petkiss, like David Senra, who I listen to because I really respect who they are as podcasters and I respect their work. And so I hear things that they do that I want to copy. But there are other podcasters who I listen to, less often, but occasionally, because I really don't care for them. Like, these are often chart-topping podcasts who somehow get the most downloads in their category, even though I've heard them and I think these podcasts are horrible. And so why do I listen to that? Because I listen to those, and frankly, I get as much inspiration from that as I get from Founders or Cost of Glory or Becoming the Main Character, because it causes me frustration. And suddenly I'm brimming with ideas of like, oh, this is terrible. I would do this better. I would do this better. I could improve this. I would improve this. The cognitive dissonance feels unsettling in your mind. And so you like kind of can't let it go until you create something better. Again, I'm not sure this is something you want to do all the time, but I think it can be really very effective for generating new ideas. Again, the quote, his superior ideas are the consequences of inferior ones. So my takeaway is sometimes you have to have contact with inferior ideas in order to give yourself good ideas. Okay, number 7. We actually did touch on this one at the beginning, but creativity as imaginative research. Okay, Christoph Wolff writes, Bach, for whom the invention of ideas constituted a fundamental requirement, anyone who had none he advised to stay away from composition altogether, as his son later recounted, understood the elaboration of musical ideas not as an act of free creation, but rather as a process of imaginative research into the harmonic implications of the chosen subject matter. Okay, so let's just focus on that last sentence. The process of imaginative research into the harmonic implications of the chosen subject matter. I love the idea of imaginative research because I think what it does is when you're trying to be creative, it takes your mindset from being focused on creation to being focused on learning. Okay, you're doing research. And I think when you do that, it takes the pressure off and ironically lets you be more creative. You know, this morning, I woke up at 3:30 a.m. for no reason. I just bolt awake, look at my watch, 3:30 a.m. I'm like, oh, shoot. And so I start thinking to myself, oh man, this is so early. I really need to get back to sleep. I'm recording today. I need to be well rested. And you know, what happens when you think that way? I can't sleep. So finally, at 5 a.m., I just say to myself, all right, I'm just going to get out of bed. Like, apparently I'm not falling back asleep. I'm just having an early day. So at 5 a.m., I say, I'm going to get out of bed. And what do you think happens? I immediately get drowsy and fall back asleep. Because for sleepiness, when you're focused on it, you can't sleep. And as soon as you kind of forget about it, then you fall asleep. Creativity is like that. When you're telling yourself, man, I really need to be creative. I have to think of something new. That is when you get writer's block. That is when you can't think of new products, new art, new ads, like whatever you work on. That's when creativity comes to the stop, when you're trying to put that pressure on yourself to create. So I think creativity, like sleep, is a problem that is best approached indirectly. So if you just think of it as imaginative research, then the creativity comes to you naturally. All right. So for example, I think J.R.R. Tolkien was genius at imaginative research rather than completely new creation. Because when he imagined Middle-earth, he didn't imagine it as this new fictional world. He actually imagined it as an actual literal history of way ancient prehistoric England. And I think he kind of semi-believed that it was a real history. This stuff really happened. And so if you put all this pressure on yourself that you have to develop a whole world, you got to invent Middle-earth whole cloth out of nothing. How daunting is that? You have to think of the language and the culture and the economy and all this stuff. But if you imagine that world, actually, it already exists out there, that history is there, you just need to do the imaginative research to discover it, then it becomes a whole lot easier. And so I think this is true of so many domains, whether you're trying to write a book in nonfiction or a book of fiction, or you're trying to paint. Now think of it as a painting metaphor. If you just look at a blank canvas and you say, okay, I need to create something new. Like, where do you even start? But if you just say, this is imaginative research, what does a tree look like? This is how Da Vinci essentially painted. He was doing research as he painted. What do these things actually look like? How do they work? How can I best express them? Then it becomes a lot easier and you can just get started on doing that research, and creativity comes more naturally. So when you are being creative, focus on imaginative research. I know this is kind of a new idea. It makes a lot of sense in my head. I hope that makes sense for you as well. And then number 8, this is my last lesson. It's probably the most simple. But whenever someone asked Johann Sebastian Bach, how is it that you were able to be so great, to accomplish what you've accomplished? His answer was, quote, I was obliged to be industrious. Whoever is equally industrious will succeed equally well. And I don't think that's true. Bach was a 1 in a billion level genius, but he was industrious. And it's only because that genius was paired with hard work that he was able to accomplish what he did. And he was able to work so hard, not out of duty, not because he had some taskmaster, not because he felt like he had to, but because he was filled with the love of music and the pleasure of doing it with great musicians, to borrow a line from John Williams. So I think that's true. You have to work hard in order to be great. And hard work is downstream of loving what you do, of just being filled with a genuine passion and enthusiasm for what you're doing. And if you don't feel that, then you got to find something new. So that ends the free version of this episode. It's longer than I thought it was going to be. Thanks for sticking with me. I also have a lot of endnotes and a lot of interesting stuff. I'm going to talk about how to enjoy Bach more. If you're someone who's always found Bach boring or wondering, where to start and how to find him accessible, I'm going to go through that. I'm going to talk a little bit more of some takeaways of how to find perfection in imperfect environment, how to find focus when you've got a lot of various interests and how Bach did that. We'll talk a little bit more about how he actually composed, what his desk looked like. We'll talk about what he was like as a parent, and the legacy of his children. There's a lot more to talk about Bach. So you can get all of that if you go to takeoverpod.supercast.com and subscribe for $7 a month. And you'll get all of the extra episodes that I release, all the end notes, all of the extra takeaways. So that helps support the show and helps me do this full time. So I hope you will go and do that and subscribe at takeoverpod.supercast.com. Or if you're listening in Apple Podcasts, you can subscribe right there in the app. And then I've got, 20 more minutes of content for you. If not, if you're just listening to the free version, I appreciate it anyways. Thank you very much for tuning in to How to Take Over the World. Before we tune out, a big thank you to Speechify. Speechify helps you turn anything into a podcast. I use it all the time for my reading. I find that when I read and listen at the same time, I'm able to retain much more of what I read, which is really important for me because I'm taking notes on all this stuff to turn into podcasts. So if you're a student or if you're just someone who reads in order to learn and to improve, then you're going to love Speechify as a great tool to help you learn and retain more. So go to Speechify.com and use code BEN to get 15% off Speechify Premium. And you can even listen, if you so prefer, if you're a real sicko for How to Take Over the World, to content in my AI voice. You can hear me narrate anything. So again, that is Speechify.com and use code BEN to get 15% off Speechify Premium. Thank you, Speechify.